Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sylvia Szyc. I'm from IPN, and I'm honored to be chair of the second panel of today's conference, Soviet-Russian Intelligence and Counterintelligence Operation in the Region. 4 speakers will deliver papers during this panel, and I'd like to remind you that the discussion will start after all the papers have been presented. We'll begin with the questions and from the audience, and then move on to the speakers. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Magdolna Baráth. She is an international relations advisor at the Historical Archives of the Hungarian State Security. She is a member of editorial board of Hungarian Historical Journal, Multung, it's correct in Hungary? And member of the advisory board of Journal of Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies. She has published widely in the field of international relations and intelligence. Dr. Baráth will present today a paper titled Failed Attempt to Build a Hungarian-Soviet Intelligence Network in Southeastern Europe in the late 1940s. Magdolna, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction and especially for the opportunity to attend this extremely interesting conference. In the last months of the Second World War, it became obvious that Hungary was to be occupied by the Soviets and that the country's political and economic life would to be controlled by the Soviet-dominated Allied Control Commission. In accordance with the provisions of the armistice from the beginning of 1945 onwards, the democratic government that had been established paid increased attention not only to reforming the functioning of the public administration and solving a serious social problems such as the land reform, but also to holding to account the officials and the supporters of the former conservative and extreme right-wing regime. The fighting was still going on in the country when to carry it out, a political police were created, mainly directed by the communists. And in March 1945, with the permission of the Allied Control Commission, the so-called military political department was created inside the Ministry of Defense. Its task included the monitoring soldiers who had gone on west with the German troops, and returned then home, monitoring the organization and contacts of officers who remained on German or Austrian territory, and arresting soldiers suspected of committing war crimes. Plans to try to infiltrate into the staff of the European branch of the American and British Secret Services were already included among the future tasks. The organization and activities of the political police and the military political department were closely followed and actively supported, indeed controlled by the representative of the Soviet State Security in the Soviet section of the Allied Control Commission from the very beginning. The so-called inspection of the Allied Control Commission served as a cover for the Budapest branch of the Counterintelligence Directorate of the Soviet Central Army Group in Baden-Württemberg. In addition to these official contacts, personal acquaintances also played an important role, even more so because the first head of the military political department, Colonel György Pálffy, delegated by the Communist Party, was recruited to the Soviet military intelligence service by an officer of the military department of the Allied Control Commission, later to become a military attaché at the Soviet embassy in Budapest. The situation was similar for other senior staff members in the department who also came from Soviet backgrounds to these senior positions. They played a decisive role in activation and the activation of a significant network of agents in Hungary, Austria, and Bavaria in a short period of time. The Soviet State Security Service stationed in the Soviet occupation zone of Austria and in Vienna provided considerable assistance. With their effective support, the officers and agents of the military political department often crossed the border in disguised Soviet uniforms. The Soviets provided them with local knowledge and false Austrian documents and safely returned them to Hungary if the plans had. So with the Soviet assistance, increasingly violent actions were launched against the Hungarian immigration, especially refugee soldiers. During 1944, 45 and 46, the focus in the organization of the military political department was mainly on subdivisions teams specializing in counterintelligence activities against the soldiers who served on the Eastern Front, the officers who fled to the West, on radio, reconnaissance, border protections, and to a lesser extent on intelligence. From the summer of 1947, when the country's prime minister and many bourgeois politicians were forced to immigration as a result of the communist efforts to take the power, the military political department was also reorganized, its tasks were extended, and its staff increased. However, there was soon to be a major change in the organizational task. The military committee of the Communist Party at its session on 7 July 1948 discussed the organization of increased defense of the army. The proposal stressed the necessity to strengthen counter-espionage and proactive counterintelligence, that is, infiltration into the enemy's intelligence services. The decision confirmed that, and the turning point was soon reached in practice as well, when in September 1948, Mihály Farkas, a former functionary of the Comintern and Deputy Secretary General of the Communist Party, was appointed as a Minister of Defense. The changes were reflected in the fact that a few months later the organization was renamed the Military Counterintelligence Main Directorate, which had become a party worker, Géza Lévész, who returned from Moscow in 1945, an officer of the Soviet army and who was recalled to this position from the diplomatic service. The activities of the main directorate were by this time supported by Soviet intelligence advisors assigned to Hungary as well. I was certain that the plan, for which was called in the internal intelligence jargon the main task, the organization of a Central European regional intelligence network, was prepared with the agreement under the direction of Lieutenant General Lévész and with the assistance of specialists from the proactive counterintelligence department. The involvement of the Soviet advisor in the development of the plan was shown by the fact that, according to informants in the Austrian State Police, a high-ranking Soviet officer was always present at the meetings held at Lévész's office. Quotation. The aim is to infiltrate into the American intelligence services, possible to assume a leading role in the American organizations which direct and carries out intelligence, sabotage, and other such destructive service against the Soviet Union and the people's democracy, decisively against Hungary, wrote the agent involved in the organization work. Himself is a former well-trained intelligence and counterintelligence officer, and according to a 1950 summary report by the Austrian Ministry of the Interior about the movement of the Hungarian agent in Austria from the spring of 1949, it was discovered that György Szentpéteri, a former captain of the general staff and a former member of the Hungarian military intelligence and counterintelligence, had been making several visits to Austria with a service passport, meeting or fellow officers and acquaintances living in emigration. All this suggested that for the planned network, they intended to find and win over the intelligence and counterintelligence officers of the pre-war Hungarian General Staff who were already living abroad. With their help, they wanted to activate the former foreign contacts. Szentpéteri first contacted former Lieutenant Colonel Aurel Liszai. He met first in Venice and later in Rome in May 1949. Liszai originally came from an Italian family with many years of intelligence experience. And he operated the Hungarian embassies in Vienna, Trieste, Zagreb, and Belgrade under the guise of the diplomatic service. Under 1944, they settled in Italy and soon became a paid informant for the Italian intelligence service. At the meeting, he agreed to cooperate also with the Hungarian intelligence for a reasonable salary. At the same time, he proposed to involve the networking work former Colonel Gottfried Lom, a former staff member of the Hungarian intelligence branch in Vienna from 1921-1922. He then was recruited and sent to Austria. Liszai was given the task of traveling to Austria with false documents and finding Major General Erwin Lahusen, a former chief officer of the Austrian and later the German counterintelligence service, who was known to be working for the American CICs. He and other former members of the Hitlerabwehr who had yet to be won over were hoped to be able to help them infiltrate into the CIC's Munich office. With the assistance of Liszai, a similar help was expected from the former Hungarian police general Hódosi, who was living in emigration, and from the former Lieutenant Colonel Kolényi, who was leading an intelligence group organized from Hungarian immigrants in Salzburg and commissioned by the US. Liszai posed as a double agent, and this way he tried to achieve results in this way. The proper conspired the relationships. He met standard in neutral Switzerland, in Bern and in Zurich in September 1949, where he received detailed instructions on how to proceed. At the time, beside the USA Secret Services building on Austrian territory as a neutral territory, there would have been a significant focus on intelligence against Yugoslavia using the knowledge of Liszai in Belgrade. In May 1950, a counselor of the Hungarian embassy in Bern, delegated from the military counterintelligence, asked Liszai also about the Italian army and the American army stationed in Italy. The details of his subsequent activity are not known, but military intelligence was still in contact with him 4 years later. Meanwhile, the key figure in networking was Captain Szentpéteri, who attempted to recruit more agents in Vienna in May 1950. He succeeded to find and getting the cooperation of one of his old agents, a former Austrian-German military officer, with whom he had worked on the Yugoslav line during the World War II. The captain promised to tip off and help build a network against Yugoslavia. However, the contacts with General Lahusen and Professor Josef Matt, head of the Slavic Studies Institute at the University of Graz, of whom Liszai befriended in Belgrade, were unsuccessful. In general, Szentpéteri's attempts to get in contact and win over his old fellow officers was unsuccessful. Changes in international relations and increasing threat of military conflicts has shifted the focus from proactive counterintelligence to intelligence. It was certainly the discussion of these changes that made it urgent for the Hungarian military leaders to press even more strongly for a personal meeting with Lissai in the Soviet zone of Austria, in Mödling, in Baden, or in Simmering. But Lissai, however, didn't undertake to do it, probably because on the occupation zone of Austria, agents of the American and French secret services and the Austrian police were constantly monitoring his meetings with St. Peter, keeping records on everyone who met and having detailed information about their discussions. The failure of the ambitious but in fact illusionary idea of Hungarian intelligence network covering at last part of the Central Europe to infiltrate into the with Soviet background using old intelligence services in the few years after the World War II under the supervision of the Allied Control Commission and the extensive Soviet occupation amid the growing power of the Communist Party. Hungarian military intelligence and the counterintelligence services mainly politically worked in politically purposes, its task being to monitor the officers of the de facto Hungarian Royal Army and the former internal army forces, both at home and abroad. As a result of the political struggles, they led to the former intelligence and counterintelligence officers drifting to different sides and then out of the former profession altogether. Their high level of training, their former experience, and their contacts in these years in a changed world were no longer enough to get them into the political decision-making centers and to Western intelligence services. As a result of the reorganizations and the permanent cleanups, the stop was eventually completely received. The dominating position being taken by the young worker cadres who had been recruited by the Communist State Party and had no professional qualification, having completed Hungarian and Soviet state security courses. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Magdalna. Our next speaker is Dr. Kevin Riehle. He is an intelligence and So once again, Dr. Kevin Riehle is an intelligence and international security lecturer at Brunel University, London. He spent over 30 years in US government as a counterintelligence analyst, studying foreign intelligence services, retiring as an associate professor of strategic intelligence at the National Intelligence University in 2021. He has written on a variety of intelligence and counterintelligence topics, focusing on the history of Soviet and Eastern Bloc intelligence service. His latest book, The Russian FSB, consists history of the Federal Security Service, was published in March 2024. Dr. Riehle will deliver a paper titled The KGB's Use of Austria as a Facilitation Venue for Illegal Operations. And Dr. Riehle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Austria is on the edge of the Intermarium, which is the topic of this conference. But that existence on the edge is itself a very reason for why Austria is so important in the KGB's illegals program. The Soviet institution of intelligence illegals developed and blossomed during the Cold War. Illegals were intelligence operatives dispatched abroad using false identities that had no overt connection to the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence services began using illegals soon after the Bolshevik Revolution because the Soviet Union had initially no diplomatic representations abroad under which it could place legal officers. And it was an important program up to World War II, but it was institutionalized and enlarged after World War II to the point that by 1954 it was administered by a separate directorate called Directorate S. Illegals performed a variety of intelligence functions, like handling agents and acting as a contingency stay-behind assets, and while their status as non-Soviets allowed them to avoid the counterintelligence scrutiny that invariably surrounded Soviet citizens. The program and directorate continue to exist today. The KGB and its predecessors established hubs around the world for supporting illegals' operations, the most important of which was the KGB headquarters on the Soviet compound in Karlshorst in East Berlin. And much has been written about Karlshorst, but but after East Berlin, the principal illegal support hub in Europe was Vienna, Austria. In my presentation today, I'll explore why Austria was so important. When Vasily Mitrokhin defected in 1992 to the UK, he brought with him 6 caseloads of documents. And portions of the materials were published in 2 seminal books, The Sword and the Shield and The World is Going Our Way, in which historian Christopher Andrew compiled Mitrokhin's notes and placed them in historical context. But despite the over 1,300 pages of those 2 books, they can't cover all the material that Mitrokhin turned over. And some of that material, which was also withheld from public view by the security service in the UK. The raw notes, however, are now available at the Cambridge University Archives in the UK with some restrictions. You'll see here on the slide here, that's a page from some of the notes about illegals specifically, and you'll see that a number of names and names especially have been redacted so that the names can't be connected to the code names. One set of illegals of Mitrokhin notes deals specifically with KGB illegals. The line officers or the legal support officers in the KGB residentures around the world, agents recruited to support the creation of false documentation for illegals, and the operations they ran to build the illegals program. Mitrokhin's materials offer a snapshot of the illegals program. During a broad range of time, 1940s to the 1970s, but with the 1970s predominating. Why Austria? Why is Austria such an important hub? Well, there's a couple of reasons. It was first the nature of Austria itself as an open society with liberal laws, especially laws that dealt with espionage. Austria passionately protected its status as a neutral state, which was declared in the 1955 Austrian State Treaty. That led to a sense around Europe that Austrians were benign and did not pose a threat to either side of the Cold War divide. That was a very useful perception for Soviet illegals. Austria's geographic location at the center of Europe, sandwiched between the Soviet bloc and NATO, made it a desirable transit point between the 2 camps. And additionally to that, Austrians held a spectrum of ideological views that made them vulnerable to recruitment by Soviet intelligence officers, including for illegals operations. The KGB used Austrian legends for illegals more than almost any other nationality. When I say a legend, that means that that's the nationality under which they were falsely sent abroad. Between the 1940s and 80s, Mitrokhin's material identified over 20 illegals documented as Austrians. Out of around 130 worldwide, and those 130 were documented by a wide variety of nationalities, with Austrians being near the most prominent. Mitrokhin provided some quantification of illegals. Of the 19 illegals operating in the world in 1971, 4 of them were covered as Austrians. 6 new illegals took Austrian identities in 1979-1980 alone. Most were Russians trained to portray themselves as Austrians. But it was sometimes difficult to train a Russian to be an Austrian, especially to speak with the proper Austrian accent. Austrians Austrian covered illegals operated mostly outside Austria. They trained to travel. They traveled to Austria occasionally to renew their passports or to solidify their legends, but for the most part, they operated elsewhere. It was risky to live long-term in Austria with a false Austrian legend, because the longer they were there, the more the holes in their legends began to appear. Their schooling didn't match, or they couldn't document their graduation from an Austrian school, or their accent sounded too German rather than Austrian. In one case, two illegals accidentally met each other, and one reported suspicion to Moscow on the other because his accent sounded too German. Neither knew that the other was a KGB illegal. I'm not sure what happened to the fonts in this presentation. The fonts are not how I chose them. Hopefully they're legible. Another reason why Austria is such a fruitful place for documenting the illegals was because the Line-N or illegal support officers in the KGB Residentura in Austria had great success recruiting Austrians who could support the creation of false identification documents. The KGB recruited police officers, local magistrates, and city officials, employees of passport and civil registration officers, and lawyers, all of whom could provide passport blanks, insert false documentation into civil registration files, create false birth or marriage certificates, and perform other important services for illegals. Others included businessmen who could provide invitation letters for visas to Austria, or sometimes simple laborers who just were used as couriers or post boxes within Austria. The KGB had such success because it could play on a mix of ideological views of the Austrians. Communist ideology on one side was supported by an active Communist Party of Austria that promoted pro-Soviet sentiments, but on the other side, the KGB could manipulate former Nazi officers resident in Austria, both because of latent nationalism and because of their guilt for having supported the Nazis. The Soviet occupation zone up to 1955 gave the KGB and its predecessors access to many Austrians, some of whom sympathized with the Soviet Union. That sympathy gave the KGB leverage over them. In one case, an Austrian citizen working in the Central Passport Office in Vienna had a cousin who lived in Moscow, and that cousin recommended her as an agent because of her ideological leanings. On the other end of the ideological spectrum, Rupert Siegel, who went on to become a KGB illegal himself in East Germany, was initially recruited based upon a pitch that reminded him that he had served in the German army during World War II, and that he had an obligation to make up for all the harm that he had caused during that time. His recruiting officer gave him the opportunity by persuading him to work for Soviet occupation forces in Austria. The KGB would use any angle it could to persuade someone to work for the Soviet cause, and people in passport and registration offices were especially sought-after sources for illegals operations. Austria's position in the middle of Europe, on the boundary between East and West, was another major contributing factor for its attractiveness for the KGB as a hub for illegals operations. Illegals posted all over the world traveled to and from Moscow via Austria. Often an illegal en route to an operating location stopped in Austria, in Vienna, and picked up a new passport to use and travel to the ultimate destination. Illegals used a variety of modes of travel, including air, bus, and a train to get to and from Vienna. Illegals traveling by train were codenamed Ozon. There was a specific code name by air, traveling by air, they actually had a code name. We're sending this person via Ozon. In 1976, the KGB tried a new method, codenamed Strela, transporting 8 illegals via a Vienna-Budapest bus line. The success of that method prompted the KGB to try a Budapest-Bratislava bus line as well. In emergency situations, a car belonging to the KGB Residentura in Vienna could carry an illegal to the border with Hungary, an operations codenamed Asphalt. The Vienna Residentura was an important player in global illegals operations. As typical of the KGB, headquarters kept statistics of operations that crossed Austria in both directions, to and from Moscow. 37 crossings in 1975, 29 in 1976. In fact, the ability to cross a border, an international border, was often the measure of success for an illegals operation. Not necessarily that they were running important sources, although that was obviously important, but often the Mitrokhin materials measure the success of an illegal by counting the number of international borders they crossed without getting caught. Austria was also an emergency fallback location for many illegals around the world, regardless of the nationality of their legend or where they were serving. Emergency passports for illegals operating elsewhere were stored at the Vienna Residentura. They were given instructions to contact the Residentura if they felt their presence was compromised, and to pick up a clean passport in Vienna for travel back to Moscow. For some illegals, like Yuri Laginov, stopping in Austria was intended to solidify their legend. As a foreign tourist, in his case, Laginov portrayed himself as an American tourist, and he spent time in Vienna in the mid-1960s basically sightseeing. So he could then, when he moved somewhere else, could say, yeah, I know Vienna, I've been there. In 1968, Vienna became an important transit point for illegals traveling to Czechoslovakia, for what the KGB called progress operations. Progress was a code name for operations to penetrate anti-communist opposition and democracy movements in Czechoslovakia after the Prague Spring. Progress operations were later directed against other Eastern Bloc countries where Moscow considered opposition groups were growing too strong. Mitrokhin's materials provide details of a KGB illegal who was sent to Poland to support progress operations in 1978, using a West German passport that listed him as a permanent resident of Austria. Another illegal was dispatched in the early 1970s for progress operations in Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. In 1974, for his trip to Bulgaria, he used the legend of an Austrian journalist with a mission of befriending anti-communists in Bulgaria. During the Cold War, Vienna had a reputation of being the center of spying in Europe, and it earned that reputation to some extent. Last year in this conference, we had a very good presentation from an Austrian researcher on why Vienna was such an attractive place. Intelligence officers from both sides of the Iron Curtain operated in Vienna with little fear of counterintelligence scrutiny. However, Austria was not always trouble-free. In 1957, an illegal using an Austrian legend was refused permission for permanent residency in Sweden after his Austrian passport came under suspicion, and the Austrians then informed the Swedish government of that. An illegal named Yuri Linov was arrested in Israel in 1973, and the KGB suspected that Austrian counterintelligence had raised concerns about his false Austrian passport. But in general, Austria was a valuable place for KGB illegals for all the reasons I've mentioned. That value did not end with the Cold War. The post-Soviet heir to the KGB's first chief directorate, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR of the Russian Federation today, has continued to dispatch illegals, occasionally involving Austria. When 10 SVR illegals arrested in the United States in 2010 were exchanged for 4 Russians who were serving in Russian prisons for espionage, the exchange took place in Vienna. 2 illegals arrested in Germany in 2011 who were actually related to that case, they're using the names Andreas and Heidrun Anschlag. Their real names have actually not been publicized to this point. They carried Austrian passports and claimed to have been born in South America, but raised in Austria. An SVR illegal identified publicly in 2023, who used the pseudonym Gerhard Daniel Campos Wittig, was documented as a dual Brazilian-Austrian citizen. Old habits die hard.
The next panelist is Dr. Tomasz Kozłowski. He is a historian who earned a PhD in political science. He works at the Institute of Political Studies of Polish Academy of Science and the Historical Research Office of the Institute of National Remembrance. He specialized in the history of solidarity and the political transformation of 1989. He recently published a book about the Polish Communism Secret Police titled Koniec Imperium MSW, Transformacja organów bezpieczeństwa państwa 89-90. And today Tomasz Kozłowski will deliver a paper titled From Reshuffle to Coup d'etat, KGB plan to overthrow the first secretary to the Polish Communism Party in 1981. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, although I'm not a specialist in history of intelligence studies. But I wanted to tell you a few things about KGB plan to overthrow the first secretary of the Polish Communist Party. In 1981, the Soviet Union pressured the communist authorities in Poland to take decisive actions against the Solidarity. The Kremlin was concerned that the success of the social movement in Poland could inspire citizens in other Eastern Bloc countries. Consequently, Moscow pressured Secretary Stanisława Kani and Prime Minister Wojciech Jaruzelski to impose martial law and suppress the opposition. The Kremlin used three tools to achieve this goal: diplomatic pressure and military threats, support of the pro-Moscow faction, and economic blackmail. These tools were used simultaneously, but more emphasis was placed during the specific periods, as you can see. My presentation will focus mainly on stage 2, during which the KGB was particularly active and played an important role. The Soviets' intelligence engagement with the Polish political scene during 1970s and 1980s was unique. Vitaly Pawlow, the head of the KGB in Warsaw, developed close ties with influential figures, including politicians and prominent administration members. His approach, which differed from the typical intelligence work and resembled regular diplomatic activity, was a significant factor in the unfolding events. Pawlow's modus operandi caused tension with the Soviet diplomats, as they believed that the KGB was exceeding its authority. In 1980s, the Soviet ambassador to Warsaw, Boris Aristov, insisted that Pawlow cease meeting with the party official. This was problematic because maintaining a stream of valuable information became extremely important during the crisis. Meanwhile, the Foreign Ministry, the KGB, and the military intelligence presented divergent assessments. In addition, they were getting in each other's way. Behind-the-scene conflicts concerned the Soviet Politburo. Anatoly Grybkov, chief of staff of the Warsaw Pact, recalled, "One day, Ustinov, who was Soviet Minister of Defense at the time, called and expressed dissatisfaction with the fact that everyone was reporting differently, hastily and contradictionally. The leadership in Moscow could not draw the right conclusions about the situation in Poland. Ustinov gave instructions that Foreign Ministry, the KGB and the military should get together and prepare information with uniform conclusions and proposals. From that moment on, Aristov was Ambassador Pawlow, head of the KGB, and Kulikov, who was frequently flying to Poland, signed all important memos and action proposals originating from Poland. Activities were also coordinated at the higher level within the framework of so-called Susłow Commission, which included representatives of Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Defense, KGB, and the party. The KGB main task was to gather information about the situation in Poland and influence the Kremlin perception of the Polish communist leadership. This included creating a matrix that outlined the political dynamics within the party. It was identifying potential allies who favored a forceful approach to solidarity. It should be noted that the matrix creation involved multiple institutions: the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of Defense, the KGB, and the relevant department of the Soviet Party. This topic was also a key focus of international meetings, including discussions between the KGB and the Stasi delegations. During these meetings, information was exchanged regarding party members' political beliefs and psychological profiles. In April, the Soviet Politburo was presented with a matrix listed trusted comrades. You can see their names: Tadeusz Grabski, Stefan Olszowski, Stanisław Kociołek, Andrzej Żabiński. The list should be expanded on General Mirosław Milewski, the Minister of Internal Affairs, who was considered a loyal ally to the KGB. Creating such a matrix was significant in the context of Kremlin strategy in the spring of 1981, in which comrade ideologically close to us played a crucial role. In mid-May 1981, Leonid Brezhnev met with Erich Honecker and Gustav Husak. He discussed the prospect of solving the situation in Poland, including a push for change at the top of the Polish leadership. Some comrades think that Olszewski and Grabski are people who can be relied upon, he said. Ultimately, he decided to establish closer contact with trusted comrades in Poland. This was the groundwork for the political maneuver. Dark clouds started gathering over Kania and Jaruzelski as the Kremlin increased pressure. Kulikov went to Poland to convince Jaruzelski to impose martial law immediately. After several meetings, Kulikov gave up and sent a message to Moscow, quote, "The party and the state leadership are engaging in dishonest political tactics, contributing to the rise of Solidarity supporters in power." Aristov and Pavlov supported him. On May 30th, 1981, they notified the Kremlin that Kania and Jaruzelski needed to step down, quote, "because they are consistently pursue a policy of conciliation." The ambassador and the head of the KGB in Warsaw both suggested a potential successor, Grabski. This assumption overlapped with the plan prepared by the 11th Division of the 1st Department of the KGB, responsible for contacts with socialist countries. According to this plan, Stanisław Kani was to be removed from the Politburo, and potential successors were Grabski, Olszewski, and Żabiński. Stanisław Kociołek was to be replacing Wojciech Jaruzelski as prime minister, and Mirosław Milewski, Minister of Internal Affairs, was to be promoted to the Politburo. In early June 1981, the Kremlin sprang into action. The Soviet embassy, the KGB station, and the military were busy finding and persuading healthy forces to express a vote of no confidence in the first secretary and the prime minister. At the same time, the pressure on Jaruzelski and Kania was intensified. Kulikov had a conversation with Jaruzelski. His comprehensive criticism left the general no choice but to admit that, quote, "it was a mistake to take up the post of the prime minister." Pavlov contacted Kania and asked if he intended to call Brezhnev. "I have no reason to call. Everything has already been decided without me," replied Kania. Later he added, "I am very sorry that you have lost confidence in me. It hurts me that people are being mobilized to attack me at the party plenum. That's why I found it difficult to talk to Comrade Brezhnev." On June 5th, 1981, another element was added to the behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Ambassador Aristov presented a letter to members of the Central Committee and their deputies. In the letter, Kani and Jaruzelski were criticized, and the letter ended with the appeal, quote, "We believe there is a still possibility to prevent the worst, a national catastrophe. There are many honest communists in the party ready to fight for the ideals of Marxism-Leninism and independent Poland." And this was a call to action before the plenum planned for June 9. During the plenum, several members of the Central Committee criticized both First Secretary and the Prime Minister. The military leaders, General Molczyk, who was Deputy Defense Minister at that time, and General Savchuk, who was a former Deputy Minister, delivered particularly harsh speeches. Savchuk stated, "Those who are unwilling or unable to oppose the spreading evil should give up way to others." Grabski, Moscow's favorite, also demanded an assessment of Kania leadership, but in his motion was defeated, with only 24 members of the Central Committee voting for it and 89 voting against. The opposition against the leadership was not strong enough. However, other factors also played a significant role, such as the Soviet letter. Any changes made under influence of such a letter could have undermined the new leadership credibility in the public's eyes. Even Stefan Olszewski, whom the Kremlin saw as an ally, acknowledged this when he stated, "The Soviet Union decides the fate of Poland, but the people decides the fate of the party." The head of the KGB intelligence, Vladimir Kruchkov, concluded that their supporters in Poland lacked essential assets: a strong leader, political support, and a program. Instead of strengthening their position, the whole operation weakened the Kremlin allies. Members of the fraction had to be personally protected by Brezhnev. Most of them remained at the political top, although some faced consequences. Mirosław Milewski lost the Minister of Internal Affairs position. He did not make a public attack during the plenum, but he prepared a speech that later fell into Kania's hands. At compensation, Milewski was promoted to the Politburo. As Andropov stated, Moscow wanted to replace Kania and Jaruzelski with other comrades, but, quote, "Unfortunately, this is impossible." The KGB chief, referring to events in which he took part years earlier, compared Poland in 1981 to Hungary in 1956. And he said, quote, "Then we could have told Comrade Rakosi to resign, but today is not 1956. The call for changes had one unexpected effect. General Jerzy Sateja, a Polish officer with the background in the military counterintelligence, presented a proposition to the KGB and Stasi. His plan involved seizing power in the country, removing Jaruzelski from the prime minister post, arresting government members, and interning oppositionists. The plan was to be executed with the support of the Warsaw Pact troops. He provided a list of his associates, high-ranking military commanders. The KGB was not interested in such a solution. Andropov did not take the conspiracy seriously. He made sarcastic remarks when discussing this issue. According to Kruchkov, the plan was unrealistic and a mass arrest operation would require at least a few months of preparation. Moreover, Kruchkov noted that no conspiracy was needed to launch an intervention by Warsaw Pact troops. Quote, "It can be done without it." Either way, the main problem was expected public reaction. A coup could have led to a general strike and prolonged involvement of Warsaw Pact troops. Kruchkov explained, "It would have been best if the Poles had solved the problem themselves. An invasion would cause a huge problem, could lead to a civil war." Moscow couldn't replace Kania and Jaruzelski, and the conservative faction had proven ineffective. Andropov suggested a different strategy, stating that the Soviet Union had a potent weapon at its disposal: supplies of oil, gas, cotton, iron, and more. Andropov noted that the previous pressure tactics had not worked, but Kania and Jaruzelski are afraid of economic sanctions. To sum up, the leaders of the Soviet Union, GDR, and Czechoslovakia supported an attempt to change the party leadership in Poland. The Soviet embassy, military officers, and the KGB station in Warsaw searched for supporters of this solution within the party. They established personal contacts with members of the party and tried to pursue them to participate in a power reshuffle. General Pavlov, the head of the KGB in Warsaw, played an essential role in this effort as he had a vast network of potential contacts. The plan failed because Kania still had significant political support and the military officers largely supported Jaruzelski. The pro-Moscow fraction was divided. Although the idea of supporting a coup was raised within the KGB, it was not seriously considered. The biggest concern was the potential involvement of Warsaw Pact troops in the conflict. The KGB leadership failure to support the hardliners led them to prepare and submit a plan involving economic blackmail. The plan aimed to worsen Poland's economic crisis, leading to a social unrest and compelling Jaruzelski to take action. Throughout the second half of 1981, Moscow simultaneously used diplomatic pressure and economic blackmail while continuing to support hardliners. This flexible strategy could be implemented over an extended period and probably generated zero costs. From the Kremlin perspective, it succeeded. In December 1981, they finally resolved the Polish crisis using Jaruzelski's hand. Thank you.
Final panelist is Dr. Douglas Selvage. He works as a historian at the Stasi Records Archive in Berlin. He is currently working on the research project Active Measures and Propaganda 1966, 1989, the Stasi, the KGB, and the European allies. He has published numerous works on the history of the KGB and Stasi, Soviet Bloc, Active Measures and Disinformation, the Polish-German relations, and the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Today, Dr. Douglas Selvage will deliver the paper titled Active Measures in Service of Empire, the KGB, and the Fraternal Organs, and the Intermarium 1966-1989. And the floor is yours.
My topic today is active measures in the service of empire. This is part of my ongoing project about the history of active measures. I tried to go through the various campaigns of active measures, show their relation to each other, how they build off one another, how they, in effect, recycle various theses in these active measures, something that's actually ongoing up until today. And previously, I've written mainly when people think of active measures, and I've also written about this as well with regard to the KGB's AIDS disinformation campaign. One usually thinks about them trying to influence developments in the West. An aspect that's not reflected as much is, for example, that they actually use active measures against dissidents at home or opposition groups. I've also written some about that. And today is sort of a new branch of this, looking at active measures in service of empire, how in the case of crises within the Soviet bloc, how the KGB and its allies, and today I'll be focusing actually more on the Czechoslovak state security, how they tried to, in effect, restore order, and justify the continuing dominance of communist regimes, and thus, of course, Moscow's empire, outer empire, and East Central Europe. Progress operations were already mentioned, which were ongoing actually since 1966, so I don't need to talk about them today. I'm going to focus today on the Prague Spring and normalization from 1968 to 71, the active measures associated with that, and then the Polish crisis from 1980 to 1983. And as I said, I'll be focusing on Czechoslovakia, but of course I know from my own research, probably because it's the best sources for these two campaigns that I have, all of this was, of course, coordinated with the KGB and with the Stasi. They're all working together. The Bulgarians were also involved, but they were mainly sort of to the side on this. It wasn't their region of operations, but they were still involved. And if you want me to discuss it, I can discuss that later. But in both cases, these campaigns of active measures that were initiated by Czechoslovak State Security in coordination with the KGB was to preserve and stabilize communist rule and thus Moscow's empire in East Central Europe. Now, of course, we already know about the case of during the Prague Spring, before the invasion, there was this famous operation by the KGB where they planted a cache of arms on the West German Czechoslovak border and claimed that these arms had been planted there by West German revanchists and reactionaries from the Czechoslovak government, former Czechoslovak government, and that this helped justify the need for, they wanted the Dubček to crack down on, try to stop his reforms. But if he didn't, they also could say, well, this is a justification for an invasion because they're not even protecting their own borders. So we know about this one, but again, here's a case that's supposedly West German revanchists and Czechoslovak reactionaries. Now, after the Prague Spring, the new Czechoslovak Interior Minister, Jan Pelnář, who was, of course, responsible for the State Security Service, wrote about or published about Operation the Aute, and this was a propaganda thesis spread also in the Czech media, but also abroad, claiming that the British secret services were behind the reform movement leading up to the Prague Spring, that this was basically all a nefarious plan from London, that they were even named as so-called conspirators inside of Czechoslovakia and outside. For example, Eduard Goldstucker, chairman of the Writers' Union, a prominent reformer, the chess grandmaster Ludwig Pachmann, who ended up leaving Czechoslovakia for West Germany, Pavel Tigrid, famous opposition figure in Paris, and Todd Schultz from the New York Times. And for this operation, what they did was they used probably an authentic British document from 1953 talking about, oh, we need to, in East Central Europe, we should undertake actions to try to, maybe overthrow one of the communist regimes. It was probably related to Albania, but this is the general document. And this is how they oftentimes use real documents, a kernel of truth, and claim that, oh, this was actually what happened in 1968. Now, why the British waited 15 years to do it, they didn't explain, but, this was all good, grist for the mills. What was actually more long-lasting, I would argue, in terms of active measures were various propaganda activities, clandestine propaganda activities, to portray the Prague Spring as a Zionist conspiracy, right? During the so-called anti-Zionist campaign, which actually started in the Soviet Union in '67, in some respects reached its height in Poland in 1968. Czechoslovakia actually didn't take part in that because of the reform movement. In fact, they were moving in the other direction. They were trying to rehabilitate some people who had been condemned during the Stalinist show trials, including the ones against cosmopolitans, meaning Jews. And so they were sort of out of sync with the rest of the bloc. So in a sense, with this campaign, they were trying to basically reintegrate Czechoslovakia into this anti-Zionist front within the Soviet bloc. And in this, already in 1970, some of the Soviet propagandists who are anti-Zionists started writing about the so-called Krigo Club, based on František Krigo, the chairman of the Central Committee of the National Front. He was supposedly the leader of this Zionist conspiracy to take over Czechoslovakia. And then, of course, there were some other reformers associated with it. And they argued that this group had tried to seize leading positions in the party and state in Czechoslovakia since January of 1968. So, for example, and this is another campaign of active measures about Zionist conspiracy. There's the famous book, Caution Zionism, an epic work of Soviet anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism by Yuri Ivanov. And a special edition was put out in Czech with an extra chapter written by one of Ivanov's other sort of anti-Zionist propagandist colleagues, Yevgeny Yeseyev, writing about the Krigo Club, and this shows, how nefarious Zionism is and as a threat to the entire Soviet bloc and the entire world. Of course, Yegor Yevseyev was famous for his book, Fascism Under the Blue Star, which basically equates Zionism with Nazism. This was typical of this sort of propaganda. Now, this was picked up by the author František Kolář. He had been purged during one of these purges in the, I think it was during the Slansky purge. Basically, he was also Jewish, but he was saying, well, why is it that, all of a sudden, there's this reform movement in 1968. It seems to come out of nowhere. And of course, the Jews in Czechoslovakia, unlike Goldstucker and some of these others, they had all been integrated into the Czech society, into communist society. Why is it all of a sudden that the Zionist conspiracy popped up in 1968? And he blames it again on foreign Zionist forces that were basically influencing Czechoslovakia and were trying to take power through this Krigo Club. So it sort of goes full circle into domestic propaganda. And of course, they're trying to spread this abroad as well, but it plays much better in the Soviet Union and in the repressive circles during the era of normalization in Czechoslovakia. Now, sort of a after operation was so-called Operation Ocean. And this was from the Czechoslovak State Security, and it was an attempt to prove to the Western left, especially in France and Belgium, that the invasion of Czechoslovakia had been necessary to save socialism, that really all it was about was trying to save socialism, and that, you know, all these criticisms in the West about poor Czechoslovakia is totally wrong, because they had this really good socialism going leading up to communism, and it was all derailed. And thanks to the Soviet invasion, or the Warsaw Pact invasion, it was saved. And they used for this operation I think it was the great grandson, or maybe it was just the grandson of Karl Marx, Robert Jean Longuet from the French Communist Party, their so-called active measure Omega, where there was a book that they published called basically In the Heart of Europe, Prague Spring or Prague Autumn, ? Basically arguing that the reforms of the Prague Spring really weren't reforms, that it was actually a counter-revolution, and thanks to the Soviet invasion, everything was restored on the right path. And this book was actually published in Luxembourg by a press. The Czechoslovak State Security said, oh, we did a good job of hiding it. It was basically a press run by the Communist Party of Luxembourg. Whether it's a particularly good cover, I don't know, but but they published it in all different languages: French, German, English. And of course, the Stasi, the HVA, was helping to distribute the German language version, gave the Czech friends 2,000 addresses in Germany that they should send it to, you know, to try to influence people. And then building off of this publication, then Longuet took part in a demonstration in Hyde Park in 1979. There was like one British trade union that was really, or the one local branch was apparently near to the communists. And they organized a demonstration basically against sort of the demonstration against the Soviet invasion of the Prague Spring, saying basically, yeah, they saved, you know, communism thanks to the Soviets. Now, interestingly, I'll sort of segue in a strange way to this. The same press in Luxembourg, the same communist press, published in 1981 this book, Quo Vadis Poland, or in Polish, Dokąd Zmierza Polska. They also, of course, had editions in French and German, blah, blah, blah. And it was distributed across the world. And also the Soviets helped with this, the KGB and also the Stasi. And it was known as Active Measure Keram. And this was part of so-called Operation Variacja. This was what the Czechoslovak State Security used for their operations, basically to try to turn the tide in Poland back in the direction of return to normal communism, and also to convince the world that everything that was going on in Poland, it's just part of a, you know, the CIA is just sort of running things there, that all these people in Poland who are protesting, actually, they're just tools of the CIA, and that none of this, of course, has any local roots. It's all just, you know, Western attempts to destroy communism. And so the Czechoslovak residency in Warsaw was in charge of supporting the healthy forces inside of Poland, but it seems that they had especially good contacts to the right-wing anti-Zionist and generally anti-Semitic patriotic union Grunwald, Zjednoczenie Patriotyczne Grunwald. And for whatever reason, they consistently misspelled the name Grunwald. They called it Grundwald. Well, I guess it's somebody knew too much German, I don't know, but anyway. And it's interesting that in this time period, there were certain trusted contacts of the Czechoslovak residency in Warsaw, and many of them were involved in Grunwald. For example, there's a code named Zdzislaw that was the president of the Grunwald organization in Warsaw. I wasn't able to track down who at this time was the president of the Grunwald organization in Warsaw. Maybe somebody here knows, but he was one of their contacts. He was used for distributing active measures. And why are we talking about active measures being distributed? The Czechs demonstrated leaflets at various demonstrations, at party congresses, at various opposition rallies. They also distributed articles for the press, and of course their famous publication, you know, Dokąd Zmierza Polska, Quo Vadis Poland. Another trusted contact, they codenamed Swojda. They didn't even really seem to hide his name. It's actually Kazimierz Swojda is what I assume. He's a committee member of the Grunwald organization. He was used for distributing these active measures, again, by the Czechoslovak residency. And he had the honor of being kicked out of the Polish state security in 1967 for its extreme anti-Semitism. And you can only imagine how extreme his anti-Semitism was if he was kicked out in 1967 before Walichnowski. So that's already a sign of how extreme he was, but they still used him anyway. Then there was the editor-in-chief of Rzeczywistość, which was sort of loosely aligned with sort of the Grunwald camp, Henryk Titchener. He was used for political reporting and the implementation of active measures in the press. So what the Czechoslovak residency was claiming is they would give him articles to publish in the press, and with minor revisions, he would go ahead and publish them because he probably agreed with them anyway, because he's one of the hardliners. And then yet another editor of Rzeczywistość, Stanisław Majewski, was also a trusted contact. But in December 1981, for some reason, they got suspicious of him. They don't explain exactly why. And so they broke off contact with him. And interestingly, although these trusted contacts, normally they would be registered in the Czechoslovak State Security, maybe in separate files. The files for at least the ones whom I have identified were actually registered under Operation Variace. That means this campaign again to turn Poland back to communism and discredit solidarity internationally. Now, another very extreme example of how the Czechoslovak residency in Warsaw was connected to the Grunwald camp was there was this infamous publication by Zdzisław Ciesielkiewicz, and he was affiliated with the Grunwald camp. Inwazja upiorów, kim byli Czechoslowacy na Soliczon. It's basically the invasion of the vampires. Who are they? What do they want? What are they counting on? Who's harming the Poles? About the contribution of Jewish chauvinists to the history of contemporary Poland. So you can sort of guess what the content of this publication was. Basically, again, blaming the Zionist conspiracy, blaming the Jews, basically for solidarity, for every problem in terms of Polish communism. And what the Czechoslovak State Security wanted to do, it's very strange in the records what they have. They knew that he was working on this, and they talked with the KGB about, they made an agreement with the KGB, and they said, oh, once this publication is done, what we should do is we should take it and basically publish it in the West, like one of these second circulations or tamistats, like they usually do. The Poles did it this time. Say it's like a Polish author in France, smuggle it back in, and publish, basically blaming the Jews for all of these problems in Poland. But in the end, basically the KGB stopped it, even though the Czechs were planning to go ahead with it. They had read the first half of the book, meaning they already had the first half of the book before Ciesielkiewicz finished the second part, which is very cryptic why that is. And they said, well, based on the first part of the book, Ivanov, the head of the Active Measures Division of the KGB, said it's basically too anti-Soviet. Anti-Semitic is okay, but anti-Soviet, that's something else, right? And they said, well, maybe the second half. Let's wait for the second half. Apparently, the second half was also problematic, so they apparently never did it. So what can we say in terms of conclusions about these two short cases for active measures in support of empire? Well, during and after both the Prague Spring and the so-called Polish crisis, the various campaigns of active measures by the other Soviet bloc allies were used to help justify the preservation of communist rule by force in both countries, and in that sense also preserving Moscow's outer empire, and so they were active measures in service of empire. And there are also common themes in these campaigns of active measures. For example, that all domestic opposition and reformers were basically portrayed as tools or agents of Western imperialists. And which Western imperialists? And of course, it was always the most reactionary Western imperialists, right? And these are the people they always list, or groups they always list, meaning, Western intelligence agencies such as MI6 and the CIA, West German revisionists and revanchists. One thing the Stasi was doing, or the HVA was doing during the Polish crisis, was basically distributing publications by supposed West German revanchists in Poland saying, yeah, now we can get to change the border. Good job, solidarity. And then, of course, there's the Zionists, right? And the world Zionist conspiracy, which sort of feeds into these other campaigns of active measures, which, are sort of, I guess, the grandsons or granddaughters of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the sort of Soviet version of it. So Well, that's my presentation for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Douglas. You have a very, very good Polish accent. This is the right time to take our seats. Maybe I will stand. Once again, thank you for all the panelists delivering very interesting and important papers. At this point, I would like to give the floor for the audience and start the Q&A session. Maybe from the left, and we go to the right.
Hello, thank you for your very interesting presentations, Paul Madrell, Loughborough University. I've got one quick question for Kevin Riehle and one quick question for Douglas Selvage. The question for Kevin Riehle is there more in the use of Austria than you said? For example, Austria's always been a mixture of Germany and the Slavic world. Is it that a lot of Austrians look like Slavs? And therefore, you can pass Russians off as Austrians, whereas you couldn't pass them off as Dutch people. When I go to West Germany, there are loads of West Germans who look like Dutch people, and when I go to Holland, there are loads of Dutch people who look like West Germans. So, is there something in the Slavic character of it? Is there an ethnic dimension to this? You didn't speak about the ethnic character, but the KGB certainly did think in those ethnic terms. So, do you think anything about that? And the question for Douglas Selvage is obviously it's a very interesting presentation, Douglas. But I think you say such interesting and such controversial things that you need to talk a little. I mean, the anti-Semitism you referred to there is unbelievable. It's really, really unbelievable. And could you talk about what kind of impact did that have? What kind of audience did it reach, and what was the effect on that? And where was it? I mean, it's very reminiscent. The Polish anti-Semitism you referred to there is very reminiscent of Russian anti-Semitism. The very, very deep roots of anti-Semitism in Russia. And could you talk a little bit more about that? And indeed, Germany. We're here talking about the Intermarium here. So did that kind of anti-Semitism have a resonance throughout the Intermarium, even in Germany, of course, where anti-Semitism is now an absolute taboo, but where there are deep roots of anti-Semitism. Could you say a little bit more about that? Thank you for all those papers.
Does it work? Yes. I have two brief questions. One is about sex. Mr. Kozłowski, you quoted this message from Kania, and it says Milewski is a bitch, and then they end up in bed, or before that they end up in bed. My Polish is pretty good. What were the words for spending time in bed and that bitch, which is in the circumstances, I'm not suggesting them of being a LGBTQ++, but it will be interesting thing to see the translation of it. The second, very brief, Mr. Riehle, your presentation I enjoyed tremendously, but maybe we should have someday a panel how weak and incompetent the Austrian security services have been for the last 30, 40 years. Thank you.
Well, this time I have a real question to Mr. Dr. Selvage. So, of course, I followed closely the ministry, the CSC process. And nowadays I have found some signs that the socialist countries' intelligence penetrated into the secretariat, which were composed by Finnish diplomats. And even the main paper from the July 75 was headed by a Finnish diplomat. And now I have some signs that he was working for Czechoslovakian secret police. And I suppose that there were more serious penetrations if it was possible. So have you made any signs or anything calling Finnish diplomats to serve a Soviet camp during the whole process.
Two questions, one to Douglas and the presentation about Poland. So in case of active measures, you mentioned one case of coordination with the KGB when they judged one book to be too anti-Soviet for their liking. Was there explicit coordination with other campaigns, or were they just like pushing the general direction and then leaving it to the friendly state security organizations to deal with those, or did they require, coordination across like the specifics of the campaigns? And on the Polish campaign in 81, I believe you said, the reason for direct involvement of the KGB with the Polish Politburo or politicians, did they bypass the Polish state security because they mistrusted them, or was there still coordination with the Polish state security, and how extensive it was? Thank you.
My question is very brief to Mr. Kozłowski and follows that of Elena. You were at one time referring to that the Soviet leadership was afraid of there being civil war. Who was expected to be the opposing party?
Somebody else? The last two questions.
Just short comment for Douglas, because I wrote a book about the Grunwald Patriotic Union based on my MA, and what I just want to say that simultaneously to this operation, active measures, the whole, association, the Grunwald Association, was run by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, by the Third Department. So it was like the Polish security apparatus, which fully controlled and had the same idea about how to use anti-Semitism. So they were like fully controlled by the state apparatus, but the outcome was very limited. In the media there were like there were articles that more than 100,000 people joined this association, but in fact it was less than several hundred. Thank you.
Thank you. Dieter Bacher from Graz. I would have a question for Kevin Riehle. Well, indeed, as you said, some traditions really die hard, as we saw, I think, in Austria in spring this year. We can also discuss about incompetencies, I think, but the question would be, do you have any information about possible cooperation within such illegal operations with Hungarian and Czechoslovakian services in Austria? Thank you.
And we have the last question from Professor Kramer.
My questions for Tomasz Kozłowski is, much of what you discussed was known even at the time. That is, it was widely reported in Western press that the Soviet Union was supporting hardliners, especially in the lead up to the June 1981 Central Committee plenum. So what I'm wondering is why, because you give the impression, at least, that this was a Soviet initiative. Certainly the Soviet Union backed it. As I say, that's been known for a long time. But I think the Polish hardliners that you're discussing were the ones who took the initiative in pushing for it. That they had Soviet support was helpful to them, but they would have done it on their own. And to describe it as a KGB plot or plan, I think overstates the case. There's no question the Soviet Union strongly backed it and was disappointed when Kania was not removed, and both Kania and Jaruzelski were not removed then. And they certainly supported the change in October, September and October, to replace Kania. But I'm wondering, it seems to me, at least, that you overstate the case about Soviet initiative. It was a Soviet-supported move. There's no question.
Okay, so we can start the answers session.
Okay, a couple. Is that working? Yes. Okay. A couple questions. The question of just physiognomy? Do they look alike? I don't. There's no mention of that at all in the materials that Mitrokhin brought with him. But the KGB always tried to make them as plausible as possible. There were a lot of illegals who were not Austrians. So they try to match the face up with the nationality? Sometimes they probably did that more than others. They knew that they had a difficult time, for example, creating Japanese illegals. They existed, but there weren't many people they could use for that within the Soviet Union. It was just, I think they looked at Europeans as Europeans. I'm not sure that they broke it down that detailed to say, well, Austrians look more like us than Dutch do, because there were people who were covered as Germans, they're covered as Swiss, who were covered as Dutch. And whether they specifically chose someone because of their face, I'm not sure they thought that deeply about it. On the incompetence of Austrian security, one of the reasons why they could be so successful was because I had some conversations with Dieter about this earlier. People in Austria just didn't think about espionage. It wasn't a threat to them. So was it because they were incompetent? Well, possibly some, to a certain extent, but was it because they were just indifferent? Or they thought the world was good, so why worry about it? And so to a certain extent, it may have been incompetence, but there were, as I mentioned, some counterintelligence concerns regarding Austrian-based illegals. And there were others in the Mitrokhin archives I didn't mention. But most of those counterintelligence cases directed at illegals actually originated with the American or British counterintelligence, who went to the Austrian service and said, you know, somebody's using one of your passports falsely. And that then led the Austrians to act. On the question of cooperation with Hungarian and Czech services, there was cooperation in a couple ways. First of all, the border guards on the borders were sometimes told to look the other way when an illegal crossed the border into Austria. Sometimes they weren't, and that was almost a test of their legitimacy or the plausibility of their false documentation. Are they even going to make it through the Czech border security without getting caught? But sometimes they just told the Czechs ahead of time, don't scrutinize this person very much, or the Hungarians. They also, in the Mitrokhin archives specifically, there was an individual who was identified as an illegal, who eventually had Austrian identity, but he was proposed by the Hungarian Communist Party. So he had kind of grown up in the Hungarian communist system, and then he was basically handed over to the KGB as a potential illegal. He was raised right on the border with Austria and Hungary, and he was then sent across basically as an Austrian citizen because he knew the area. And so in that case, he was plausible because it didn't take a lot for him to learn that background. So yes, there were also times, I'm sorry, quickly, there were also times when an illegal abroad was told, if they get caught, tell the police, whoever it is who arrested you, that you're a Czech or a Polish or a Hungarian smuggler. And that's why you have a false passport. And then the idea is to have you handed back to the Czechs or the Hungarians or whoever, and then from there in Prague or in Budapest, the KGB would then pick you up and you'd be okay. So just to actually give the backstory, I'm not who I say I am. I'm a Czech smuggler. Hand me over to my country, they'll arrest me. And then that was a get out of jail free card for them. So yes, there was definitely support on personnel levels and various operational levels.
Okay, first the hardest question about the bitch word. Maybe I didn't translate it perfectly. In Polish he used the word kurwa, which means prostitute. And basically my understanding of it is that he sold himself to the Soviets. And the story about sleeping in the same bed, I think Kania was expressing they've been through good and the bad through all the years, and he was promoting a career of Milewski, and he thought he's his friend. So basically he felt betrayed. Probably that's why he used such a strong language, because there's an emotional component to it. He just felt betrayed. Answering, maybe that's a fundamental question about the KGB. I didn't say it's only the KGB plan. The KGB was one of institutions who was involved in executing this plan, and that's the reason I think the first impulse was made by Moscow, because this plan is, they start to talk about it in April, and there is a clear moment of making the decision in May 1981, where the leaders of the Czechoslovakian GDR and Soviet Party are making the decision, and then there's a coordinated operation made by the KGB, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the military, but as well it's coordinated with the party members and the intelligence community in other countries, Czechoslovakia and the GDR. Stasi and the GDR party, Communist Party, are making a big push and trying to push members of Polish Communist Party to overthrow Kania. And you can see that in those Mitrokin files that Kevin mentioned, the unpublished one, but as well there's lots of documents in the Stasi archive, and there are some documents in Poland about that, which you can clearly see that the impulse came from abroad, not from Poland. About bypassing the Polish intelligence and counterintelligence, all branches, I mean, the KGB and the military intelligence, Soviet military intelligence, were creating a matrix for the Polish intelligence and counterintelligence. They were talking about who can we trust, who cannot we trust. So basically they didn't treat the whole Ministry of Internal Affairs or whole army as a monolith. They treated it the same as the Communist Party. They knew they had some allies, some hardliners, and there's some people who think about political solution. So that's why they didn't work with the Ministry of Internal Affairs as a whole or army as a whole, for example, just with the individual people. By the way, the German army was doing the same. For example, there's an interesting meeting in 1981 with the commands of a few armies of the Warsaw Pact, when basically the whole meeting is about they are trying to tell who's the good comrade in Poland and who's the bad one, and who can we trust. And the versions, the view of the Germans and the Soviets and the Czechoslovakian are not the same. So they are creating a map on their own. And the civil war in Poland, the Soviets were afraid that if there's going to be a coup or something like that, the Solidarity will start to protest on a street, and there's going to be a clash between army and the protester. That's what they meant by the civil war. The problem is that the Khrushchev said it bluntly: we can send Warsaw Pact troops at any moment. But we don't want to do that. And if we support the coup, and if there's going to be a backlash by the Polish society, we're going to end up with invasion anyway. So we don't want to go into that solution. And basically the problem is even in the middle 1981, the Polish authority didn't know if the army would shoot Polish protesters. Polish army would shoot Polish protesters. There's a large discussion. Well, maybe not large, but there is a discussion in Polish Politburo about that.
Okay, Paul asked a very interesting question about the impact and audience for these anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic active measures. Luckily, I was able to provoke Shemek into saying something. But for example, some of these campaigns, like in 1968, they became involved in inter-party struggles. And then, of course, within the party, people who just happened to be Jewish, who were identified with cosmopolitans under Stalinism, or then with reformists in 1968, they were basically then said to be, you know, Zionist conspiracists against the existing order. And of course, these active measures are also used abroad. So for example, you hear from the Bulgarians and from the Czechs about how they're translating these into Arabic and publishing things about how in Poland it's the Zionists who are trying behind solidarity. And it's a way to also warn the Arab countries to be wary of solidarity and basically to support the communist regime. It's interesting what you said about how the MSV ran Grunwald. It's interesting that the Czech residency didn't know that, because the Czech resident who was reporting about all of his contacts with these people in Grunwald also was saying that he was officially in contact with Czech foreign intelligence. They knew who he was. And for whatever reason, they didn't tell him. Both the HVA and the Czech comrades are complaining that the Polish Active Measures Division wasn't talking to them. Of course, Grunwald was probably not run by the foreign intelligence. It's run by another unit, but still it's very interesting and raises a lot of questions. In terms of explicit coordination with other active measure campaigns, what I've noticed is with these active measures campaigns is there's a lot of double dipping, where, for example, there's this whole campaign of active measures against Zionism, and it was called Research or Badatel for the Czech State Security. And this measure, publishing Czesokiewicz's book, was supposed to be part of Badatel, but it was also discussed with the Soviets and with the East Germans with regard to Variace or Adler or whatever the Germans called it. And so it's sort of like double dipping on active measures. Now, in terms of coordination, there were certain themes for these active measures campaigns, including in the case of the Polish Solidarity movement. Those generally came from the KGB. And if you look in the records, like all this list of things that they're trying to achieve with their active measures, and they discuss them with each other, you know, the East Germans with the Czechs with the Soviets with the East Germans, and they all tend to be very similar. And I suspect that, you know, they came out of Moscow. And the last question about CSCE, in my book, I was writing about how the diplomats on the East German delegation, how some of them were Stasi officers, of course, and were involved in other activities. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I've read also in different places that the CSCE secretariat was infiltrated. Also, of course, there were Finnish spies for the KGB. Whether any particular ones in this case were involved, I don't know. I would just say one should be wary of these registrations. So, for example, the Austrian diplomat Franz Czeska, who was very much involved in the CSCE process, was registered by Czechoslovak State Security at one point as an agent. And basically he had met with them and they said, oh, you wrote a nice article about this. Can we publish it or distribute it? And he said, yes. Then another time he said some things that were anti-American. And then this guy registered him as an agent. And it's a way for the state security officer to say, oh, I have this great agent in Austria, Franz Czeska. He's a very prominent diplomat. You should be very wary and be sure to read the file and see what exactly they were supposedly doing before you reach the conclusion that they were working for them. And of course, one thing we don't know, and I try not to write about this, is there's also cases of double agents, right? And who knows who's a double agent and who's not, because usually the Western sources aren't declassified.
I think that this network building attempt was more a Soviet than a Hungarian plan, and reasons of its failure was that the starting point was wrong. Those people, those officers who they wanted to involve this network building were the representative of the old conservative and right-wing regime, and the democratic changes in Hungary after the World War II were not in their favor. They didn't want to cooperate with the Hungarian secret services. Moreover, they have no more his former agent. And the other problem that the inner struggle of the secret services became victims of these people. For example, St. Peteri, who was a key figure in this plan, was arrested, and other people who was the people of the Soviets and came from Soviet backgrounds to the leading position in the military counterintelligence, also became the victims of the inner struggle, also was arrested. So, and the other reason is that the main focus of the secret services was not on this intelligence network building, but the struggle against the inner enemy, the enemies of the hostile elements, so-called hostile elements of the former regimes, and concentrated on this work, not on the intelligence.
Thank you, Magdolna. Once again, thank you for our panelists and participants of this panelist conference. Because we passed the time, I wanted to invite you to 1 hour lunch break. Thank you.